Hi, my name is Laura Dio-Lacey. I'm here to introduce the panel on Southeast Asia. I'm the Managing Director of the Milken Institute Asia Center based in Singapore. When ASEAN was created in 1967, was basically to foster friendship and collaboration between the Southeast Asian nations. It was a nation-building effort. Now, 47 years later, ASEAN is a year away from being part of the creating the economic community. It has a growing population and a rising middle class that is basically attracting the attention of global investors. And this is why we're here. We're here to basically talk about what are the opportunities are in Southeast Asia, what are the challenges. I mean, there are a lot of challenges as well, or risks, such as corruption, political instability, and issues of rule of law. The Milken Institute has just opened an Asia Center in Singapore this past September. And next September, we're going to have our first event. So I would like to invite you all to come to Singapore on September 18th, 19th. We're going to have an event which is hopefully as much of a high caliber as this event, but smaller in scale. We're going to have around 250 people. So now I would like to pass it on to Michael, who's going to moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be here, and we hope to have an interesting hour of conversation on ASEAN and more about its potential and its future than anything else. But I thought I'd start this panel, and with apologies to those of you who have far more familiarity with the region than perhaps I. I have spent 10 years in Southeast Asia, and I'm a private equity venture capital guy, so that's my background. But the slide on the screen right now, I apologize again that it's small, but the little blue countries that you see down in the bottom corner are the 10 current ASEAN nations. And they have all sorts of relations, ASEAN, with many other parts of the world already. And those are shown in some of the other colors. So red is ASEAN plus 3, which is China, South Korea, and China, South Korea, and Japan, of course. And then there is also other dimensions of relationships that ASEAN has. For example, the East Asia Summit, comprising ASEAN, Australia, India, New Zealand, Russia, and the US. New Zealand and Australia, by the way, also have a version of free trade already with countries in that area. And then, of course, we have the ASEAN Regional Forum that consists of ASEAN, Bangladesh, Canada, Mongolia, North Korea, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the EU. So although we're focused today on ASEAN, I think it's important to appreciate the relationships that they've already built in the rest of the world. And you know, it's an area that's often, ASEAN is often talked about as being too much talk and not enough action. And I think there's a good reason for this, which we need to understand right from the beginning, and that is that the whole foundation of ASEAN is one of consensus, and I'm going to let the panel develop more aspects of that. But we are ready now to see ASEAN take off, and I think it has huge potential. So if I could have the next slide, please. And this is a real eye chart, and I apologize, but really, again, the focus of today's panel is the regional economic integration of the region in 2015. And the slide, even if you can't read the numbers, what the slide does show is that there are actually huge differences between both size, population, and GDP, GDP per capita and purchasing parity power, and so on and so forth. And nevertheless, I think a very strong will to move forward. A few other statistics about the area, which just as background, over 600 million people, that's about 9% of the world's population. About 3% of the global land area, but a larger proportion of the world's oceans. And average GDP per capita is about $4,000 on a PPP basis. And so a pretty significant purchasing power even now and rising rapidly. GDP growth, by the way, has averaged about 5% in the region for quite some time. So the total GDP of the nation, summed at the bottom, which again I'm sure you can't read, so I'll tell you it's about $2.5 trillion, and that ranks it as about the 8th largest economy in the world today. couple of other quick statistics. FID from the US, as we learned yesterday, was about $160 billion. But only 62 of that 160-odd billion has gone outside Singapore, and I think that's something, again, that panel will perhaps pick up on today. So if I can have the last slide, please. This slide might be a little bit more readable. And what it's intended to do is show you some of the differences or some of the comparisons between ASEAN and some of its surrounding blocks, namely China, India, and I even throw in the GCC countries. And I'm not going to pick out any particular statistics, except you can see that actually ASEAN is well placed and has some real key strengths. For example, stock market capitalization higher than that of India, and other such statistics as that. So potentially a great place for business. And I'm going to stop there. We have a great panel with us today, and I'm not going to introduce them. Their resumes are far too long and distinguished. But what I'm going to do is, I think one of the best places to start is always just a little bit of history. And so Paul Wolfowitz on my left has spent many years in the region, and also preparing, when he was in State Department, a lot of position papers and so on and so forth for the US government. And so I'm going to start with Paul and ask you, Paul, if you could briefly give us perhaps your perspective on the evolution and development of ASEAN to the present day.
With the emphasis on briefly.
Well, yes.
Because it's a lot to cover, and I can go on at great length, especially about Indonesia, which is frankly one of my favorite countries. I was the ambassador there, and I fell in love with it. You've got to be very careful not to remember you're still the ambassador to the country, not from the country, but all the same. But let me just try to put it in with 3 points. And first of all, this is a very diverse group of countries. 10 countries now. It started as only 5. Everything from Burma, which is hopefully just emerging from the real darkness of one of the more tyrannical regimes in the world. And I'm optimistic about Burma. I've been there 4 times in the last 2 years. I think it really is trying to change, and they were smart enough not to kill Aung San Suu Kyi, so they have somebody to negotiate with on the other side, which is important. To Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim population of any country in the world, but you have to say it that way, it's not a Muslim country. Islam is not the state religion. In typical Indonesian fashion, they have 6 state religions. Vietnam, which was our enemy not so long ago, which is discovering in its own version of free enterprise and market capitalism. And as the slides show, well, first of all, as a group, we're talking about 600 million people. Most Americans, at least I've found, are astonished. They don't realize we're talking about half the population of China. It's much younger than China. It's not hitting the kind of demographic cliff that China's going to hit. It's been growing on average 5% a year. And frankly, Indonesia is one of the amazing success stories. It was sort of the sick man of ASEAN until the 1998 financial collapse, at which point a lot of people said it's the end of the country. It's too poor to manage democracy, and here they are about to hold a democratic election later this year. No one has any doubt that it will be free and fair, that it will produce a new president, and that president will be generally accepted by the population. Whether, I think it's certain to be a male, whether he's going to be any good or not is a different question. But that's stability, and it's not bad when you're growing at 5% or better, which they are. So it's a big group of very different countries, and that brings me to the second point, which is ASEAN was originally started, frankly, to make peace among these 5 countries. In 1967, Suharto had just taken power, and in taking power, it ended what was euphemistically called confrontation. It was basically a war that his predecessor had declared on Singapore and Malaysia, sending saboteurs into Singapore to blow up buildings and kill people, claiming the northern part of Borneo as being part of Indonesia. And Suharto came in and said, that's the past. We are the former Dutch East Indies. Our borders are where those used to be. And he started to make peace with his neighbors. And even though I think in the diplomatic dusty records, there's still border disputes between virtually every one of those countries, the only real border dispute in that part of the world now is between the various ASEAN countries who've managed to keep this unity and China, which is pressing on them. It's when I was asked in 1981 as head of the policy planning staff to take the Southeast Asia portfolio by Secretary of State Alexander Haig, if you remember that name, I go back a little too far. I said, well, wait a minute, isn't that the place where we just lost a huge war? Well, yes, it is. We're not really expecting you to do anything very important, which is what I figured out. Well, I soon discovered this was an amazing place. It has come so far in 30 years, it's hard to believe. And it's really important to emphasize that, because if I hope as we get into the discussion here, we're going to talk a lot about difficulties in each of these ASEAN countries in doing business. It's not simple. They're developing countries. Government doesn't work the way we think it should, or with the speed we'd like it to. There's corruption almost everywhere, different degrees. But what I have seen over a 35-year period is incredible progress, and people who generally are committed, as I would put it, with no offense to anyone here from the Middle East, unlike the Middle East, where all they seem to do is create problems. In Southeast Asia, all they've been doing for the last 35 years is solving them. And I think there's a real optimism that brings. People have an attitude that the future is going to be better than the present. You need to work at it. And I think you will find, if you go in there as a foreign investor from any country, there are huge opportunities, because that's one more thing to be said, and that is, with the possible exception of Vietnam, I think even Vietnam, you're talking about societies and economies and governance institutions that are much more open than China's. China's a great place to do a lot of things, but it is a very structured, difficult bureaucracy. And so I think there are huge opportunities there, and I think the past is the future. Things have moved, sometimes slowly, but they have kept moving forward, and I think they will do that for quite a long time. And in that other packet, I saw a slide. At present growth rates, which every reason to assume will continue by the end of this decade, the combined GDP of the ASEAN countries is going to be twice that of Japan's, I believe. Or larger than Japan, sorry, larger than Japan. That's pretty impressive. We're talking about big stuff.
Thank you, Paul. And from the past then to the future, and the near future, and let's fast forward and really look at what some of the early successes are going to be under ASEAN 2015. And Kurt, perhaps you would like to make some comments there.
Well, I think the last point that Ambassador Wolfowitz said is the right one, that it's the level of optimism that tomorrow is going to be better than today that really does permeate the region. There are problems, there are difficulties, but for the people in this room, there are opportunities. And we can talk about a $2.5 trillion economy, but put that in context of India, which is a $2 trillion economy. I mean, that's what we're talking about, with 600 million people versus 1 billion. You're talking about 100 million more people that are in Europe. And what is often given short shrift, I think, is the continued integration of Australia and New Zealand, which really is becoming more and more a compact with ASEAN. So you're talking now a $4 or $4.3 trillion economy. So the opportunities are there. I think the hope that TPP, as an example, is if we can get some of the countries there to even go further on rule of law, transparency, intellectual property rights, then it's the job of the business communities, whether it be American or otherwise, to show that that means something, and the investment comes behind it to really show as a beacon to the other countries in the region. So I think that we all have a part to play in it as get the policy side right, that we then reward the folks that are doing what we ask, particularly in intellectual property, and move forward behind that with our investments. We have a huge part to play. Michael we may get into sector specific, but I don't know that there's a sector they don't need. And I was on a panel yesterday with Ambassador Cardin. There are challenges in the agriculture sector. And the point that David made yesterday is you have 40% of the workforce in Indonesia is in the agricultural space, but only 15% of their GDP is. So what are you going to do with those people as they make that change? But there are opportunities there. And I think that we have the ingenuity and the entrepreneurship to get in there, but we have to be part of the conversation. And if I am here in LA for one reason, it is to be the Pied Piper for you all to say, if you're doing business maybe for the first time in Asia or starting to don't get sucked into the gravitational pull of China. There's another story out there. And it's one where I think it's less complicated. I think there's more opportunity. And your government is there to help you, is basically why I'm here. But we do have an opportunity there. So that's how I see it going forward, but I'm sure we'll get into some of the more, the prickly wickets, as they say.
Thank you. And Sharon, turning to you, again, from a perspective of somebody from within, and Sharon runs a sovereign wealth fund, the think tank portion of a sovereign wealth fund in Malaysia. Any particular sectors that you see? I've always heard aviation is one that's going to be off to a fast start, perhaps banking, perhaps the ag sector, I don't know. Perhaps you give us your views on that.
Well, thank you. I come from ASEAN, so it's a bit difficult sometimes to explain to people who don't know about ASEAN what ASEAN's about. But if you look at the slide before this, which has all the ASEAN economies on it, and it's really diverse. You've got Singapore, which has got close to Swiss GDP per capita, and you have very poor countries like Laos and Cambodia. And they've all come together under ASEAN to develop as one economic unit. And the slide after this actually tells you why. Because if you're sitting in Cambodia or even Malaysia, and you look at India and you look at China, and you think you'll just get overwhelmed. But then you realize if you all get together, you have an economy which is bigger than India's and a quarter the size of China's, and bigger than the GCC. So you've got the wall of money in the GCC, you've got the billions in India, and you've got the Chinese economic powerhouse. So the way when ASEAN came together, the idea was that together we can do better. Now the ASEAN way is the ASEAN way, which is everything is done by consensus. So no one can force anyone to do anything. Now a lot of people criticize ASEAN because of that, but as Ambassador Wolfowitz pointed out, that's led to peace and stability. And a lot of people now, of course, take that for granted, but it was not taken for granted in the time when ASEAN was formed. ASEAN is a very young organization. It was formed just after I was born, so it is extremely young. And at the time, that was a time of communism, dominoes falling, the works. And the idea that all these nations could get together and keep peace amongst them is amazing. And of course now ASEAN is moving towards this ASEAN economic community, and the idea is that one day will be a common market. And I have to stress it's one day because ASEAN does everything by consensus. There is no one person who can force Laos to come to the same standards as Singapore tomorrow, and you can't expect Laos to come to the same standards as Singapore tomorrow. That will take time, but the intention is there to create the economic community. Now in terms of how it means to businesses, Malaysia is, where I come from, is a big believer in ASEAN. And Khazanah, which is the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Funds, had as one of its policies to create regional champions. In other words, making companies within Malaysia, Southeast Asian companies. So for example, the company I used to work for, CIMB, is a banking group, and our joint venture partners are the principal, who very kindly invited me to this conference. And together, we have, I shouldn't say we, CIMB has a large regional presence. It's the biggest branch network in ASEAN, over 1,000 branches. And it's big in Malaysia, it's 5th largest in Indonesia, it's reasonably sized in Singapore, it's number 9 in Thailand. It's got a huge network. And the idea is that there is such a thing as an ASEAN economic community, a real one, composed of businessmen thinking and believing that ASEAN is a place to grow, not something just mandated from the center, but a real belief within businesses. And there are many other Malaysian examples like that. Axiata, which is also owned by Khazanah, is a telephone company. So it's number 1 in Malaysia, it's number 3 in Indonesia, and it's got again a reasonable presence in Singapore and in Vietnam and in Cambodia. So you have this idea of companies actually having ASEAN as a business strategy and succeeding in it. And I think that kind of measure of success shows you how important ASEAN is. I mean, I've got some statistics on IPOs, but I think I'll go through it a bit later in terms of how investors view investing in ASEAN companies. But yeah, to that extent.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate that answer. Of course, I think Kirk already mentioned, and perhaps Paul as well, that there are some prickly areas to deal with, and let's come to some of those right now. So I want to ask the panel their thoughts on whether they think, to use an anecdote, a rising tide floats all boats. You see from the slide on the differences between the different ASEAN nations that indeed there are some fundamental differences. Each of the speakers have pointed them out to some extent. And so I want to pose the question to the panel of whether we're going to see some countries left behind, or whether we will in fact see the entire economy of the region lifted. And the hope here is, of course, this consensus approach that the region takes might lead it to a different direction than perhaps one might argue the EU has perhaps gone. So, Sharon, let me go back to you and get your views on. Do you feel that this is something that is going to benefit every country, and are they going to benefit equally? Or do you think we're going to see some immediate differences and some countries almost beginning to grumble?
I don't think so. I mean, if you look at countries like Burma and Vietnam and even Laos, the first investors in there were ASEAN investors, because they're the ones who really understood the place. So investors from outside would see, oh, I can't see anything in Laos or Vietnam, it's too complicated for me. But if you're from ASEAN, you can understand the countries there, so it's much easier to invest. So, at one point Malaysia was a very big investor in Vietnam, so was Singapore. Similarly, in Laos, the Thais are investing heavily in Laos. And you can see that going all around. So I do think that by being together, they stand a better chance. I mean, honestly, if you were Laos, you really don't have many options. You're a very small country. And quite an impoverished country, and by yourself, you have no clout at all when dealing with the rest of the world. But if you're part of ASEAN, you do, and the ASEAN businesses will help. For example, after the 1997 crisis in Indonesia, Indonesia had to sell off a lot of its prized assets, really, to pay off the debts it owed to the world capital markets. Now, one of the big buyers was Malaysia. So Malaysia bought up banks and plantations there. Now, at one point it was seen, but of course it's a funny kind of thing. On the one hand, Indonesia was glad that someone was coming in buying the assets. On the other hand, it did feel that they had to sell the assets very cheaply to the neighbors. So there's a slight bit of tension on that one, but still, the answer was that Malaysia was the only country willing to come in to buy. No one else was willing to invest in Indonesia come 1999 or 2000.
Thank you. Kirk, any comments on that?
Well, I think that one of the conversations we've had a lot at this conference we have in the region is, as China moves up the value chain, that there will be more opportunities for manufacturing in the places like Laos. And the question is, what else is going to fill that space as well? And we had talked about the aerospace field. I mean, currently 6% of Indonesians have ever been on a plane. That's going to change. In ASEAN, the average ASEAN citizen has been goes on a plane twice every 2 years, every 10 years. Americans go on 2 a year, and that's the average. This is going to change, and so if you look at that market, we just had the Singapore Air Show, which I think is about to become, if not the biggest in the world, it will be one of the biggest because of the opportunity in that market. Well, the airports have to be built, planes have to be serviced, and the opportunities for that throughout the region are huge. But that's just one area. It's hard pressed for me to say what they don't need there, and I think that the workforce is there for someone to fill that need. I mean, they're going to need insurance on their motorbikes in Indonesia, and they're going to need to go to movies. I just came from Disney this morning. I couldn't believe that Indonesia had a higher box office for Iron Man 3 than Spain. I mean, that's indicative of the consumer market that's there. And we're not even getting close. Right now, you have 525 million people in Asia total that's considered middle class. By 2030, that number will be 2.7 billion. That'll be 6 times the consumer market in the United States. So yes, there'll be some fits and starts. And yes, we're going to have to help everyone kind of get through that with businesses' help. But we've been there. We are there. And the number actually on U.S. FDI is about 195 billion in ASEAN. And while 135 of that is directed at Singapore, that doesn't mean it stops there. We have 3,600 American businesses in Singapore that most of them have regional responsibility. So that money doesn't stay in Singapore, and it goes out. And I think it goes out from the country that I don't think anyone can argue has the most transparency, the most commitment to rule of law, and the most business-friendly and universal values for good dealing in business. So we are together as a partner trying to be involved in this conversation with business, with government, and I think that I think Paul's right that you see a move to people wanting that. That's why you have Vietnam being involved in TPP. They're completely transforming their economy and state-owned enterprises because they see the value of a commitment to rule of law and transparency. We have to help and work with them to get them there.
Thank you. Paul, turning to you, and another perhaps area which could be advantageous or perhaps a drawback. What differences do you see in regulations and how they will impact internal growth and internal trade between the region, and looking at ASEAN as a place to do business with from afar, both exports and imports? How do you see that regulations may or may not affect FDI and intra-ASEAN trade as well?
First, on coming to that, but I mean, on your question of does a rising tide lift all boats, I think, there are ASEAN countries that are struggling. It's interesting, if you go to your last chart, I think I'm right that two of the three poorest countries are Myanmar and Laos, and they have the highest growth rates. They have a lot of catching up to do, but they're moving. Cambodia is not. In Cambodia, it's a governance issue, which is actually going to come to the regulation point. Thailand is actually the most disappointing country. It used to be the star of ASEAN, at least other than Singapore, and it's much bigger. And it's a governance issue. It's internal to Thailand. I don't think there's any country in ASEAN that would say, we're suffering because our neighbors are doing well. I think everyone would say we're doing better because our neighbors are doing well. Maybe not as well as we should be. And to me, by the way, I think the Philippines, I was deeply optimistic, if that's the right word, about where the Philippines might go after they peacefully got rid of their dictator in 1986. They have managed a pretty stable democracy. The communist insurgency is gone, but the Philippines still struggles. I don't entirely know why, but they export a lot of the best workforce anywhere in the world, but they send it outside. So the Philippines has some work to do. I think on your question about regulation that, next time we do a panel, you know, it's funny, forgive me, but when I was president of the World Bank, I never was quite able to get the World Bank staff to include in my briefing books for meetings the rankings in the Doing Business report, because that was done by the IFC and that was private sector and there was no money attached to it. So I always included it. And with the best countries, I remember specifically with Tanzania and with Ghana, when you pointed out how poorly they were doing, instead of fighting and saying, oh, your methodology is wrong, the way some European countries would do, they said, oh, that's terrible, and they would go back and try to fix things. I think that's the phenomenon that you're seeing by and large in Southeast Asia, which is the countries that are not doing as well are looking at the ones that are doing well and saying, wait a minute, there's a way to deal with our problems, and it's so much more motivating than going to Switzerland or Sweden or the United States and saying, well, they're doing so much better than we are, but after all, we don't have a chance. Well, you can't look at how well Indonesia has been doing lately and say we don't have a chance. And Indonesia can look at Singapore and say, wait a minute, if we really want to go to the next stage, we better start cleaning up our act, which does need a lot of cleaning up. I mean, let's be fair. You know, corruption is, unfortunately, to some extent, it's endemic in any developing country because of weak governance institutions, weak political institutions. I believe, I wish I knew my history better, but you may be able to correct me, I think it was endemic in Singapore in the 1950s. And Singapore is one of the, maybe you have to have a Lee Kuan Yew, but Singapore and Hong Kong are two entities that have cleaned up corruption dramatically in 50 years, which demonstrates to me it can be done. It's not something you simply have to live with.
Well,
Thank you.
I would blame Malaysia for that because they were part of Malaysia back then.
I blame the British.
Yes. Well, the British,
the
British were very good at one thing, and that's why I always feel you don't have to worry too much about India, with no disrespect to anybody from India in the room, but you don't have to worry too much there, because what I've always been told about India is they took British bureaucracy and perfected it. So, Charon,
yeah.
I want to ask you a question about cultural differences in the region, and whether you feel that cultural differences, you gave us a great answer when we had the telephone conversation, and I enjoyed that thoroughly, but do you think that the cultural differences in the region will hold ASEAN back in any way?
Thank you. No, on the conference call, I was talking about the CIMB advertising campaign for ASEAN. So the first banner was the durian. I'm not sure if any of you know what a durian is. It's the most wonderful fruit in the world. But a lot of people kind of gag when they first smell it, because it smells, you know, described as mixed between rotten socks and camembert. But that is the king of fruit in ASEAN. Everybody eats durian in ASEAN, so it's found throughout Southeast Asia. So on the one hand, we're all together. We all eat rice. We all eat rice with our fingers. So there is a lot of commonality, and we've all got Indian and Chinese influences in our food to various extents. So there's a lot of commonality. But there are two parts of ASEAN. There's Malaysia and Indonesia, Brunei, Philippines, which are what used to be called Nusantara, which is the idea that there's one people. So Tagalog and Malay are similar. Malay and Indonesian are very, very similar. But the problem about Malay and Indonesian is they're almost identical, but not. But there are a few key words which mean different things. For example, if I say tewas in Malay, that means I beat you at a game. If I say tewas in Indonesia, it means I killed you. So when we talk business in Indonesia, it's much easier to talk in English because then there's no misunderstanding. If one talks in Malay, one talks in Indonesian, it gets quite hairy. And of course, there's a Thailand and to the north where they are far more similar in cultures and in food. Buddhism is probably to the north, and Islam is probably to the south. But yes, there are differences, but they are great similarities.
Thank you. Thank you. And now as the...
Can I add one more thing
yes,
to that?
please. Please.
I mean, one way I had of describing Indonesia to the many congressional delegations, not so many, but the congressional delegations that would come through, most of whom knew nothing about the country when they arrived, I said, look, if you put Indonesia on a map of Europe, it would stretch from London to Moscow. That sort of, because it's on the equator, the Mercator projection doesn't show you just how long it is.
Yeah.
And truthfully, in that space, there are as many different ethnic groups as there are in all of Europe, and as much religious diversity. One of the miracles of Indonesia is that they did manage to get their version of Malay adopted as a national language, even though it's the native language of only one small province in Sumatra of 5 million people. But they have these deeply rooted, great historical, cultural traditions. The Balinese are one. They had their own alphabet they invented before they had any contact with others. Javanese, which is 2/3 of the island of Java, the single largest ethnic group in Indonesia, again, they had their own alphabet, their own language. By the way, an impossible language to learn. If they'd ever tried to make Javanese a national language, they'd still be speaking different dialects now. Buganese, who are the original boogeymen, had their own alphabet, and the Bataks, who used to be cannibals in Sumatra, had their own alphabet. So alphabet's just one part of it. You're dealing with people with a great sense of their ancestry. And where American high school kids go to Washington for their spring visit, Indonesian high school kids go to visit Borobudur. Most of them are Muslim. Borobudur is the second most impressive Buddhist monument outside of Angkor Wat. So if you're an Indonesian Javanese Muslim, you're aware that your great-great-grandparents were Hindu, their great-great-grandparents were Buddhist, and somewhere before that there was this kind of Javanese mysticism, which was a respectable philosophical way of approaching life. It's pretty hard to say there's one right way. So the Indonesians, and I think this is somewhat true of Southeast Asians in most places, it's frustrating. They don't use Occam's razor as often as we might like, but it's not a bad thing when you come to dealing with ethnic, cultural, and religious differences to blur the lines, and they're very good at blurring the lines when it needs to be blurred, and I really applaud that part of it.
So a great melting pot, it seems, of different cultures, and probably not too much in the way of barriers there. As the quiz show host often says, we're now going to go to the quick round, because I do promise the audience time to ask questions. And so quickly for the panel, for new investors thinking of entering the area, some advice: start small, where to start, how do they approach the area if they've never been there before? Kirk, let's start with you.
Well, quickly, as I said before, we have that model out of Singapore. And I think that for companies, most of the big folks are there. So as you, as investors, are looking to bring some of your companies that you invest in overseas, the model is you set up shop in Singapore where you can have a good quality of life for your folks. They're not completely out of their element. You've got rule of law. You've got good schools for kids. But then you dip your toe in the water, whether it's Thailand or Vietnam, whatever your product is, and then if it works, you reinvest. You don't have to take off this massive bite that you do in China or India and some other parts of the world. And it's not, you won't be the first at it. And as I said, there's 3,600 companies there now. And there's a model, so you're not reinventing the wheel. And we can help a lot in the government, and the AmChams out in the region can help a lot, the ASEAN Business Council. And there's a lot of best practices that are out there. So I actually think it's a much more sensible jump if you're going to come to Asia to do it that way. But I might be biased.
Sharon, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, you can view ASEAN two ways. One is a center for manufacturing, and a lot of people do that. China plus one philosophy. So people have their backup factory in China, in ASEAN, and Thailand's an excellent example of this. A lot of car manufacturers are now based in Thailand, and they use the Thai base to supply Thailand, ASEAN, and actually the rest of the world. So you can use it in manufacturing base, or you can play the consumer story in ASEAN. And sorry, I'll just have to give a few statistics. In 2012, 3 of the biggest IPOs of the world came from ASEAN. In fact, they all came from Malaysia, which tells you how big the market was and how bad 2012 was for global IPOs. That was the year of Facebook. So the 3 companies that got listed that year to make it the top 3. The first was Felda. Felda is the world's largest palm oil plantation company, and that was a $3.3 billion IPO. So there's one way to play Southeast Asia, which is we produce a lot of palm oil, we produce a lot of agriculture. So that's one way to play it. The second one was IHH, which is a Khazanah listing, which is integrated healthcare, which has a string of private hospitals in Malaysia, Singapore, a few in Indonesia, and some in India and some in Turkey. And that was a $2 billion IPO, and it had a negative PE. In other words, it was making no money when it got listed, and it had a 45.8 times forward PE, but it's still oversubscribed. And so that's another way of playing it. And the final one was Astro, which is the television channel, which 1.5 billion IPO, and the PE was 26.9 times. Again, tells you the kind of belief people have in the consumer and the rising middle class. I mean, the theme of the rising middle class is probably the big Asian theme, and it's probably the biggest ASEAN theme, because if you look at the statistics, there are a lot of people there who have gone out of poverty and who have money to spend.
Yeah, I don't think it's been said. 65% of ASEAN is under 35 years old. I mean, that's their demographics. We talk about the demographics, but compare that to the region in China and frankly here. I mean, it's an amazing market.
Yes.
Historically, the big plays have been resources, palm oil and coal and oil, and there's still money to be made there. But I think it is the consumer goods now, and what I think is really the future. This large middle and growing middle class in Indonesia and elsewhere is going to have huge demand for healthcare, education, and residential housing, all of which are seriously underserved. And I think they're all areas, by the way, where I think the Western, and specifically, if maybe I'm just being parochial, American and European expertise in the service industries and in health presents some big opportunities. Although, you've got to recognize that you're still dealing with people whose ability to pay is way below what we've been oriented to. But I think there are ways to adapt to that and to plan on this enormous growth that's coming in both numbers and in income.
And I'm going to put in a self-serving plug here for the agriculture area, because of course a lot of those economies are quite agrarian in terms of the number of people who are employed in agriculture. And it's no surprise, and we've heard other panels at the Milken conference here on the fact that the world, this has been known for a number of years, the world's population is going to reach 9.5 billion people by 2050. And by the way, that's not just a target date out there. There's a rising line all the time. And so it's a question of how do we feed the world? Sure, food prices have actually been dropping in some sectors in the last year or two. I tell you, I believe strongly those are aberrations. And that when you take the same amount of arable land, no more arable land available in the world, aquifers and irrigated land is not going to increase. The rising demand for protein as people become rise into the middle classes and so on and so forth, and protein takes typically, meat protein takes 20 times as much land as rice or wheat or something of this sort, that food becomes incredibly important. And so we need to employ technology, not necessarily to displace workers. There's bound to be some displacement of workers. I'm not talking about putting $400,000 John Deere tractors directly into Indonesia today, but there's some much more efficient systems and much more higher yielding traits, and dare I even mention GMO and beyond GMO, as crops that can be grown in that area that are going to be in demand not only in that region alone so as it can feed itself and it gives itself food security, but also that they could become a huge export potential for the rest of the world, particularly those parts of it that are going to be very short on food by 2050. So with that, panel, thank you for your stimulating words so far. I want to throw it open to the audience and see whether there's some questions out there. There do seem to be some, so let's start over there. This gentleman, please use the microphone so that we can...
Look, I think putting a label around this region actually helps it a lot in that it puts it on the radar for everyone. But we haven't talked about the relationship between China and ASEAN versus the US and ASEAN, or the West, if you like. You know, one could play a cynical view and say China's got high inflation. A lot of its, coastal manufacturing industries are being hollowed out and they're heading southwards. If you do the economics for large numbers of Chinese industries, you should set them up in Indonesia, Thailand, etc., right? Moreover, US trade policy towards China is going to probably get more aggressive, tires being one example of that, tariffs on tires. Do you see any risks of Chinese retaliation trying to destabilize what the ASEAN markets are trying to do?
Well, I can tell you that from a government point of view, and I say this often, that over the last 5.5 years, the one thing you can say about our relationship with China is it has become much deeper and much more cross-section. We have 92 separate strategic dialogues with China that and that's a huge number than it used to be. So we are talking a lot. The United States government and our military have provided the safety and security for the region for over 70 years, and every country has benefited from that, none more than China. And I think that they realize that as well as we do. They are competitors in many areas. But as it relates to ASEAN, ASEAN wants us there, and they want Japan there, and they want Korea there, and they want Europe there, so that there are multiple factors bidding against each other to keep everyone at the lowest possible price, and why we always want competition. China has a lot of internal issues, but so does America, and so does each one of these countries. That doesn't change on an international level why we all now are completely interdependent, and we're going to have to compete, and I think China understands that.
Sharon, from somebody in the area and a country that's getting pretty close to the Chinese border, if not your perspective.
Can I take the long view? The long view is, let's go back to the 15th century. And I say the 15th century because that's before the Portuguese arrived, the Portuguese pirates arrived. And the world then actually looked a lot like the world today. We had, let me just get this right, we had the Abbasids dynasty, very strong in the Middle East, so we had a very strong Middle East. We had the Mughals, or the Delhi Sultanate in India, so we had a very strong India. And we had the Ming dynasty, very strong China. So ASEAN's always known this. And the ASEAN empires of the day, you had Angkor, Ayutthaya in Thailand, and the Malacca Sultanate, which is probably the heyday of Malaysia, the Majapahit Empire around Indonesia, and the Bugis, the bogeymen as well. And so ASEAN very soon learned that you have to keep the peace between all the big powers. And it's always been the ASEAN way of keeping the peace between the big powers. But as a result, ASEAN was totally enriched because we had Buddhism was brought over from India, Hinduism was brought over from India, and Islam also came from India. It came from the Middle East, but via India. And so there's a great time of peace and prosperity in ASEAN in the 15th century until the Portuguese pirates arrived in 1511 and sacked Malacca. But until then, it was all
parochial.
Sorry. But until then, all was well and good in Southeast Asia. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And one other point I'd just like to make is that it was a Muslim empire in the Middle East. It was a Muslim empire in India. And all the emissaries of the Chinese empire were Muslims as well. The famous Chinese admiral, Zheng He, was Muslim. So, Islam is completely pro-trade and pro-international relationships, and this idea that Islam is somehow, anti-progress or anti-trade is completely wrong, because if you just look back in history, in Southeast Asia or Asia as a whole in the 15th century, Islam was the dominant religion, but it did not stop trade at all. In fact, trade flourished. The Portuguese, Tomé Pires, wrote about Malacca that there were 84 distinct languages spoken in Malacca during that time. It was a really cosmopolitan place. I think more languages, I guess, than even New York. So there is a lot to be said for ASEAN and being able to navigate ourselves between the big empires of China and India and the West.
If I can come back to the China question, though, and not go back to the 15th century, but just go back to the 1970s, I have some critical things which I'll say about China in a moment, but it really is important to realize that there was an almost revolutionary change in China's approach to Southeast Asia as a result of the combined Sino-Soviet split and the U.S. opening to China. And where before roughly 1972, 74, China was actively engaged in destabilizing every single country in ASEAN, including particularly Malaya, where there was this long-running insurgency. Thai Communist Party in Thailand, there's some debate about their role in the upheaval in Indonesia, but I think it was quite substantial. Then you get, by the end of the 1970s, all of those revolutionary movements have been basically defanged by withdrawal of Chinese support, and guess who rescues Thailand from a possible Vietnamese invasion? It was China with their own invasion of Vietnam. It's a very complicated history, but for those of you who know it, they, quote, taught Vietnam a lesson for invading Cambodia. The lesson consisted of a fairly flawed invasion of northern Vietnam, but it kind of said, we can take a lot of losses. If you try to go any further, we'll beat you up. And I think that's what was going on, and I think it really did contribute to stability in Southeast Asia. Now, fast forward, it's not quite as great a picture now. I think China is rising. China feels anything around their periphery is sort of theirs by right, kind of like some people think about Crimea, I suppose. And they're stronger, and they'll be there permanently, and the U.S. is far away and kind of flighty. And I think my own feeling is, though, that their behavior is unifying ASEAN. I think you asked whether they would destabilize it. I think they're actually pushing ASEAN together. An Indonesian friend of mine put it, we expected China to show its fangs, but we didn't expect them to do it so soon, and it's been a wake-up call for people here. Even on this somewhat dangerous terrain, I remain optimistic that in the end of the day, China will be prudent. The ASEAN countries they like having the friendly United States a long way away, but not so far that we forget about them. And hopefully we won't forget about it either. I think this is a success story that's very much in American interest to preserve.
Thank you. Another question.
Yes, I'd like to direct this probably to Mr. Wolfowitz. Mr. Ambassador, you probably, I don't think I want to hear the government line. I just want to hear what your thoughts are on this, particularly given your security background. And this is going to tie into his question as well. As you know, and this is probably where you're going, the PRC claims the South China Sea, the 9-dash line, the cow's tongue. A couple weeks ago, as you know, the AFP, they have their Filipino Marines out there on the Second Thomas Shoal, and the PRC White Hulls blocked the resupply. How do you see this playing out?
Look, I think it's destabilizing behavior. I think it is dangerous. I think it should be recognized as such. I think it's important for the Southeast Asians themselves to be prepared to defend their own claims, but they should have American support in doing it. And I do think the Chinese are prudent. They are careful when they meet resistance. I think they don't necessarily pull back, but they stop pushing forward. But I think this is going to be a serious jousting. It's been going on actually for quite a while. The couple of things you mentioned look a little more serious than historically. And by the way, they'll also use, as they are, their economic leverage on the Philippines to say, you know, we can mess you up economically if you resist us. and I'm sure some Americans will say, well, why is any of this a concern of ours? And I think the answer is because peace in the Pacific is a rare commodity. It hasn't been true in most of history. We had one really terrible war there. We don't need another one. And I think you're much less likely to get one if the U.S. stays engaged and the countries of Southeast Asia maintain a reasonably unified position. But it's a problem you can manage. You're not going to solve it. It's going to be there for a long time.
Okay.
Well, I think Ambassador Wolfowitz said it right. The foreign minister from Singapore said it global forum in Singapore about 3 months ago, that this is probably not going to be solved in his lifetime, but to keep the temperature down, because the freedom of navigation is fundamental to everyone continuing to rise. And everyone sees that, China included. So I mean, I think that the U.S. has been pretty blunt about our obligations both to Japan and the Philippines under our agreement. Some people didn't realize that, for example, our treaty with Philippines covered their ships, not just their land. And that was made clear after the last incident. So I think what ASEAN wants is to know that we are going to be there for a long time. And I find it to be an odd question when we have huge investments in the region. As I say, the U.S. has invested more than the next 3 countries combined in ASEAN. And number 4 is Switzerland, which always drives me nuts. The State Department won't let me say the next 4 countries, but we all know that some of that Swiss money is American money and all kinds of things. But China is number 5 in their investments in ASEAN. So we're there. We're not going anywhere. And they're important to us economically. They're important to us in a homeland security issue, given the ports and the things that go through there. They're obviously important in so many other reasons. So we're not going anywhere.
Thank you.
But I'm going to slightly gloomier note in this. I mean, I do think, but confess, I don't like our inaction in Syria. I think there are things that we could be doing that would have made it much more difficult for Assad and for Putin and for the Iranians. So without getting American troops involved. But the fact that we've done nothing in Syria, the fact that we have more or less accepted the Russian annexation of Crimea with some sanctions, and I'm all for the sanctions and I'm not for military action. But don't kid yourself. What we do in one part of the world is perceived in another part of the world. And there are doubts, and I share some of them, but frankly, I share them much less. I've seen the U.S. go through cycles, and when people tell me, oh, the U.S. is in a period of decline, I say, well, we've been in quite a few periods of decline. Wait till we come back. You may not entirely like that either. But I think we are, whether we like it or not, a global power. You cannot pivot to Asia and forget the rest of the world. I think that was bad language, if you'll forgive me. But I think, I frankly think that Obama's Asia policy is pretty good. And if it were backed up by a stronger sense of American resolve elsewhere, I think we'd be in good shape.
Thank you. Question down the front here.
I just wanted to say that as an Australian diplomat with 16 years in ASEAN, this is all music to my ears. The Australians have been there for a long time, as you know, and I think pivot is a wrong term because I think you have been there for a long time and will continue to be. One thing I wanted to ask you, talking about China in another sense, is how you get the American business community to take their eyes off the shiny prize that is China and really convince them of the efficacy of investing in ASEAN, which we've known for a long time, and how you think the TPP will play out. What chance of success do we have for the TPP, which is important?
Let me try and address from purely a personal point of view. My firm, I'm a partner in a private equity fund, and we were very actively involved in investments in China from 1998 to 2008. We've not made a single investment in China since 2008. The simple reason is valuations are just out of sight. And in spite of the fact that my wife comes from a well-known Chinese family, and so I'm considered a Chinese son-in-law, we still, even through those connections, we don't see the best deals. The best deals are being done domestically. There is so much cash floating around in that country that I think it's very difficult, other than for a major corporation, that's a different story, but for the small, medium-sized business, I think that some of the opportunities in China are past, and we have moved our entire operations, now headquartered out of Jakarta, and we see much better opportunities in Jakarta in the ASEAN region. We're already an active investor in Thailand, but now Indonesia and the rest of the ASEAN countries. And so I think that some of those simple economic factors alone will blunt, to some extent, the attraction of China. It's just got too expensive. It's not that it's any more difficult to do business in, but other members of the panel, please, views on that.
It's not more difficult to do business in China than it was 10 years ago.
Correct.
But I think, I mean, there are different sets of difficulties. I think it is more difficult to do business in China than in Southeast Asia. You're more likely to have the government really turn on you and expropriate you more or less, or steal your intellectual property. Maybe I'm not sure about this, a little less bribery and corruption. But look, you've got problems everywhere. But I do a little bit of consulting for American companies in Asia. I stay away from China, partly because I just don't think I can understand it, but also because I think on the whole they can assess the risks better. It's more open, and that's the case I would make for it. I think, the question earlier, I think, referred to someone earlier referred to the fact that as labor costs rise in China, I think you can expect to see Chinese capital moving to Southeast Asia as well. And I was thinking, I was hearing that, to some extent, I think the parallel is more than just, I think it's real. You saw this incredible, those of us who are old enough remember, the South and Southwest of the United States did not used to be the growth area. But as costs rose in the Northeast, now the Northeast has its problems, but a lot of wealth, a lot of investment went to the South, and I think it's happening over time now in Asia as well. So that would be, to me, another reason to go there.
I was going to say on quickly, I think, as you've heard, the information's already out there, that there are easier options. When I was preparing to go out to post, I did kind of a look at who was coming to Asia. And for years and years and years, Hong Kong was a destination of choice. But what I found, and from going to National Association of Manufacturers, Chamber of Commerce, ASEAN Business Council, is that you would see companies that would normally have been in Hong Kong, that vast majority of them would come to Singapore, but some went to Bangkok, some went to Jakarta. And it's unless you needed the access to mainland China, you were picking up and moving. Now, the second part of your question is TPP. I know it sounds like party line, but the recent news out of Japan seemed to be good. And I think I know that Ambassador Froman was up till 3 o'clock in the morning 2 nights in a row, but the press secretary spoke afterwards and really went into drilled down and talked about the agricultural market being opened up. Now, I've read in some of the news afterward, well, why wasn't there some grand announcement? But as you know, being involved in TPP, if depending on how far Japan went, that now has a domino effect on seeing everybody's best offer. And so as we loop that together, my hope is that we will know very soon what everyone's best offer is. Work on Canada for me, Michael. But I think we have moved a tremendous distance. But the reality is, it's a good economic deal. There's no doubt about it. But the strategic value of this agreement is massive, and it's not just for Asia, but it's also opening up Peru and Chile and Canada and Mexico, and really expanding that highway of trade, of just people-to-people contact. And with the expansion of the Panama Canal, I'm from Miami, so I'm hoping that we see that right through this to southeastern United States into Latin America, and it really building these corridors of trade.
Can you do something about Harry Reid?
Well, he's only one vote, sir.
Oh, he's more than one vote. Come on, be fair.
I feel confident that once we get a deal and you put that agreement in front of members of Congress, you will get it done. I have every confidence, and that's not just spouting. I did politics for 20 years. I can count to the number. I think we get there.
Good.
Do we have any other questions out there? No. Then I'm going to ask the panel perhaps to just summarize some of their feelings on again, let's go back to the optimistic side, to the opportunities and so on and so forth, and just perhaps summarize some of the sort of final advice they might provide to you in the room. Thank you for listening to us. But final advice on any fronts. And Kurt, let's start with you.
Well, I think that you hear the optimism from us, but we're not naive. You're going to have bumps and bruises along the way, but you'll have them anywhere. I think the thing to remember about ASEAN that is different from other emerging markets is they are forced to work together because of China and India on both sides. They're forced to find ways to maximize their impact and work together. And even if they don't get to the full economic integration by 2015, who cares? It took Europe 20 years to get there. And the point is, are they on a trajectory that, say, Latin America is not or Africa is not? And the answer is yes. And I think that's where the level of optimism, there are challenges. And I think the agricultural sector is a real big one, the labor market. But you all in this room have the opportunity to do good and do well. And we'd like to see it from an American policy point of view, and I think it's crucial to our national interests. I think there's two economies you can count on for the next 50 years, and that's North America because of the energy revolution and Southeast Asia, and I believe it. So anything we can do to help, we'll be there.
Thank you. Sharon, some closing remarks.
I just echo what everyone else said, and please invest in ASEAN. It's by far the best place to invest, and please headquarter your companies in Kuala Lumpur. It's far cheaper than Singapore, and people are much nicer, and the food's much better.
You get talking about food, but I would just say you get what you pay for. But that's just me.
Can I get your second slide back for a minute?
Yeah. Can we put up the second slide again for a second? There we go.
And look at that second column, population under 25 years, roughly 50%, except for Laos, where it's 60%. This is a whole new generation. I am an old, whatever noun you want to use. When I went to Indonesia, I could talk to people who had lived incredible history, who'd fought wars against the Dutch, who had brought Indonesia out of a near-communist takeover, who had seen Indonesia go from a place where people literally, on the island of Bali in 1983, 40,000 people starved to death, if you can imagine that, who brought the country through all of that, but who, frankly, are like fish out of water would be fish out of water in a conference like this. There is a whole new generation of Indonesians, and I think this is true across Southeast Asia, who are so much a part of this modern, globalized world economy, and they are moving into more and more important positions and real leadership roles, and it's going to change the face of those countries, and I think in a very positive and inspiring way. So I talk about the youth bulge. If you want to, at my age, you look at people under 25 and all you can do is get envious.
Well, I hope we haven't painted too much of a Disneyland picture of ASEAN for you. There are certainly I think we have balanced that with some of the challenges and the pitfalls, and some of the questions have been excellent in terms of security and risk. But I think the panel have very competently answered some of the questions around risk and addressed a lot of the opportunities there. I just want to close by thanking the panel most sincerely, thanking you as the audience, and saying the best food I've ever had in any part of the world is in Southeast Asia, throughout Southeast Asia, and I have eaten everything, and I mean everything from silkworms to snake blood to...
now you're undermining the recommendation.
Well, no, I call that good food. The thing is, if nobody tells you what it is, it's tasty. I can assure you, all of it is tasty. And if it isn't tasty, it's covered by so much great spices, you'll never know it anyway. So with that, and the people, almost universally, the friendliest people you'll come across, incredibly hospitable. So it's a great place of the world. If nothing else, go and have a good time there because it's a great tourist destination. So thank you all for being a great panel. Thank you, panel.